So hello again, and welcome to MAGS for tonight's Rare Book London panel, Towards Inclusive Bibliography, co-sponsored by the Bibliographical Society of America and the UK Bibliographical Society. Erin Schreiner, the Executive Director of the BSA, who organised this event, could not be here in person, so in her stead, I shall be your host, and I shall introduce tonight's panellists. I am Fuchsia Vorenberg, and I am lucky enough to work in this beautiful antiquarian bookshop. Many of the people in this room will consider themselves to be engaged with the community of the London rare book trade. Be it as booksellers, collectors, librarians, or readers, the way in which these and many other roles contribute to the intentional circulation of texts has a direct impact on the prioritization and preservation of certain types of cultural heritage. The type of works which have been elevated by traditional bibliographical practices are evident on the shelves all around us. Each of these books may have passed through hundreds of pairs of hands before arriving in this bookshop, and they have been selected as significant because they speak of or for a community. This selection process, however, has the unfortunate consequence of, in many instances, excluding, omitting, or objectifying those outside of that often privileged community. The work of recovery, either by re-examining extant texts or by seeking out those previously disregarded, has leaned heavily on the labor of people whose voices are not fairly and accurately represented in the canon defined by Western European values. The intention of tonight's panel is to highlight the work of some people filling in those gaps with the explicit intention of demonstrating how bibliographical scholarship and practices can be channeled towards a more realistic understanding of historic and contemporary relations between people and texts. Each of tonight's panelists has excitingly different perspectives on this, and I'm very much looking forward to what I'm sure will be a series of presentations varied enough to stimulate an idea of the infinitely expansive possibilities beyond. Just a bit about housekeeping. I will introduce each panelist before they speak, and at the end of all three presentations, there will be time for a few questions, after which we hope you can stick around for more informal conversation and refreshments. So, without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our first panelist. Eyob Darillo holds a bachelor's degree in History of Art and Archaeology from SOAS, University of London, a master's in Film Studies from Birkbeck, University of London, and is currently completing his doctorate at SOAS's Department of Religions and Philosophies. His doctoral research focuses on the nature and historical development of the concept of Ethiopian magic and its use within a specifically Christian context. His particular area of expertise includes Ethiopian history of the 15th to the 19th century, Ethiopian manuscript illumination and Ge'ez literature, liturgical and hagiographical texts of the medieval period. Eyob is currently working at the British Library in the Department of Asian and African Studies, where he has served as curator of Ethiopian collections. He co-curated the British Library's highly acclaimed exhibition Harry Potter History of Magic, and he recently curated the British Library's exhibition African Scribe, Manuscript Culture of Ethiopia, the first exhibition to be held at the library devoted entirely to Ethiopian manuscripts. Thank you very much, Eyob Darillo.
Thank you for that. It reminded me to update my CV. It's something. Today I sort of wanted to talk about the book as an object. It's something that's been on my mind now for quite a long time. So when they asked for this paper, I thought, let me attempt to talk about this, the concept of the book, or the book as an object in Ethiopia, which is a very difficult sort of area, which not much work has been done. As you can see, the title, More Than a Text Carrier, I came across this term which was used by an Ethiopian scholar who was working on a biblical text. I think it was the Book of Enoch, which was a Jewish sort of text that was translated into Ethiopic. One of the person in the audience asked well, if the manuscript this text is written on, if it's 15th century, then how can you say it was before Moses? This was a question. The person asking this question was not familiar with manuscript. And the Bowsy, who was giving this lecture, replied, the manuscript is just the text is just a text carrier. And it was a very interesting, meaning that we cannot date these texts. So that's where I got the sort of idea to give that title. Just some background to the place I'm talking about, which is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is very big. So once upon a time, it was part of a very big kingdom that also included Meru, and then sort of Lower Egypt, now Somalia, etc. But a lot of the historical sort of past of Ethiopia still remain in the north of Ethiopia, where in Aksum, where it's Tigray. One of the most impressive sort of remains is this temple in Yiha, which is in Tigray, which I saw recently. It's amazing construction with some inscription there in the Sabian language. So this is just a background to give you the context where these books we're talking about emerge. So this is Ethiopia, early Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum, which sort of includes Somali, now Somali, Eritrea, Kenya here. And this is sort of a very sort of Western imagination of what Ethiopia was. And it's kind of based on Herodotus' account of Ethiopia, where he gives a description of Ethiopia being from here to sort of half of Africa, and doesn't really doesn't make sense now. So the most important period in Ethiopian sort of history is the 330 AD. This is when King Izana converts to Christianity, and the first coin with the cross is minted. And so this is sort of the pretext to say, for a lot of academics or archaeologists, sort of date the introduction of Christianity to Ethiopia this period, just based on the archaeological evidence. But there are other accounts where Christians were already sort of living in this area because of the persecution, the Diocletian persecution. There were many Christians roaming around here. So that period is very important. Then we go to King Caleb's invasion of Arabia. So before the rise of Islam, sort of this area where now Mecca was under Ethiopia, under the rules of the Sabian kingdom. There's quite a few remains. So after Caleb's defeat, sort of later on Islam sort of arrives, the followers of Muhammad come to Ethiopia. And of course you had Bilal as well, who's an Ethiopian, who's a follower of Muhammad. So this is just to contextualize what Ethiopia is. Okay, so the language is one that is really overstudied. It's a Semitic language, which is part of the Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, all of this. So languages of family. It's received a lot of attention from scholars compared to other fields of study, especially in Semitic sort of circles of research. Because in Ethiopia you have also 7 languages which are Semitic, not dialect languages. So if you're studying sort of the gene pool of a coffee, you need to go to where there are different types of coffee. So there's a great interest in the language. So it's pronounced, that's the indigenous name of it. The classical name for it is Ethiopic, like Arabic and Coptic. So this is the Greek sort of the term used to describe. So today it's used as a liturgical language. This is what historically it sort of stops being spoken in the 16th century and becomes like Latin. But we don't really have that much evidence. But we know it wasn't used after that. Here, the whole theory about language, if you're interested in it, this Afroasiatic, it's a deadly text. If anybody wants to read anything, it's basically scientific. So there are some debates as to whether Semitic language originated from Ethiopia. This is one school of thought. So we don't want to go into that area. So this is modern day Ethiopia, which has been, so with a lot of the sort of the colonial, lines and what was what. So this is where Ethiopia is, and this is where sort of Tigray, the historical areas of Ethiopia is. And Ethiopia is very diverse in terms of religion. So there is Muslim, Christianity, Judaism, and sort of indigenous faith. So it's quite diverse. So some things to think about. I was in a talk a while ago at Hamburg, and it was presented by a really interesting scholar called Steve Delamarta, who works on digitizing manuscripts. Steve doesn't speak Amharic, so he's not interested in the text that much, but he's interested in the book as an object. So he gave us this amazing talk about what they see when they're digitizing manuscripts, what it reveals. And so he said something that you cannot see what you can't understand. So when you take a picture of the manuscript and you see the book there, if we use just the book, but you don't see how those shapes, the shape of the book has been changing to what we have now, the sort of perfect or not perfect square. So the other thing is to know the conception of sort of the Ethiopian manuscript culture. You need to sort of understand sort of what makes up this tradition, and I put here in bracket manuscript cultures because Arabic is also supported in the manuscript culture, as well as the Judaic Ethiopian tradition as well. This is also supported in the manuscript culture, so it's just not just the Ethiopian Christian. Manuscripts to this day are still used in monasteries. They serve a purpose, even though printing, though introduced to Ethiopia very late in the sort of 19th century, there was a strong resistance to printing for a long time. They're still used in their sort of traditional context, where certain revered books like this, the Gospel, the Garima Gospel, which is held in a monastery of Garima in the north of Ethiopia, is the earliest manuscripts, which is dated to 390 to 570. This is carbon dated, so it's not text. And this is the actual text. This is the text block. It's very revered. So it was written by Garima, hence the name Garima Gospel, one of the 9 saints who came to Ethiopia in I think the 3rd century or so. And it was written in a day. This is what the hagiography tells us, that God allowed the saint to finish the book in one day. So they held the sun up basically for 24 hours to finish it. So it's very revered. When you go to this monastery, and the priests are very protective. Now we have problems with eBay and looting, so you can't really access, and quite a lot of things have been sort of missing. So it's an amazing monastery. I've been fortunate enough to see the other things, not this, because it's a relic. And one of the most interesting accounts of this book is that in the medievals, many important Ethiopian scholars who were in the church, monks, did borrow the book and take it home for their reading. So it's explained in one of the manuscripts. So yeah, manuscripts are still in use. So it's a living culture. It's not a dead culture. So that's very important. And manuscript was a production before the medieval period. I repeat that. A reminder of something. So the basic feature of the Ethiopian text codex, this is the structure of it. 2 wooden board. The leaves are gathered, the parchment, and sewn together. It's a simple codex, and possibly the primitive early books, you could say. So there's nothing complicated about it. It's robust, it's strong, it's very resisting, very strong. It's durable. So the parchment, the term parchment in Ethiopia is branna, and it comes from the word light. And this is because once the parchment is prepared, it creates this sort of thin layer like a paper. So when you shine it through a light, it comes through. This is one of the explanations we get. So when you describe a manuscript in Ethiopia, you say, this is a branna, I have a branna. This is what the priests would use the term, not a book. The term book is mazahaf, which comes from the word zafa, to write. And also the Quran is also described as mazahaf, musahaf in Arabic. And that's very interesting. So anything that has the term book in Ethiopia, mazahaf, it's something that should have a religious content, a spiritual, like dus, which is blessed. This is a very interesting distinction they make. So they wouldn't describe a secular book as maz'haf, although later on we do have the term maz'haf used to describe the book of Enoch, etc. And this is the structure of the codex with sort of what we call the naked sort of back. You can see the gathering of the leaves, so you notice 8, and sometimes this is very important for dating and to see whether the text has changed, because one of the beauty of this codex in Ethiopia is you can undo the stitch and add more parchment as you go along. So sometimes you have manuscripts with different dates. And the format, this is a very interesting thing that, again, one of our friends were talking about, whether it's never a perfect rectangular or square. But as we go on through history, the books before the 15th century tend to be very long and sort of narrow. And later on, with that Islamic or Arabic influence with the Arabic Codex, they become more of a square. So there's a lot you can sort of learn from seeing a manuscript, where even if I look at this without a blink, I know it's after the 15th century because of the shape. This is from one of our British Libraries manuscript. And that, in its simplest form, this is the Codex, where when you get to European books, as you can see, they're very complicated, the binding, very tight and difficult. So if you damage it, it's not easy to repair like this book. It's very easy to repair. So there's practicality of it as well, the book. So one thing that interests conservators a lot where I work is the stitching. And I get a lot of conservators trying to explain to me how the book is stitched. And they're very fascinated, but it's only in Ethiopia where the two threads are stitched together. So this what they call the linked stages. Only in Ethiopian Codex where you see this and nowhere else. Hence, it's sometimes called Coptic Binding. This is an example I took from a book to just kind of show you that structure of how the Codex is put together. Then once the Codex is put together, sort of lavish manuscripts would have this leather covering, which is sometimes imported from the Middle East, depending on the quality. The colors are always either red or dark brown, never black. We've never seen an example of a black covering. And it's layered with silk. This is royal manuscripts. And some of these silks, there's a very interesting article by Richard Pancrast on the silk, trying to figure out where they came from and how did they get to Ethiopia, because some of them were from Europe, and so some of them definitely from Persia, while some could have been from early Coptic textile fragments. It's a very interesting way of also dating the manuscript. It's really an area there's not much work been done. So if you guys are interested in sort of writing or researching Ethiopia as an open field and still untouched. So we get to a point where there is sort of a uniform of all the codex, of all the books. There's a structure to them. There is, when you look at these books, there is some uniform and where decisions been made somewhere. How has this decision been made? Who's planning all of this? So the type of book formats are sort of the codex, which I said the maz'haf, the book, and also known as Branna, and the scrolls are called Kitab, which comes from the Arabic word book. It's very interesting. Only all scrolls are described as Kitab, and then we get this Coardian sense. It's not that common, but we have a few in certain manuscripts. So this is where you also have the binding as well on sort of the side. Then unbound leaves, which I've seen quite a lot in monasteries where piles of parchment are just left on a display case or in a box. So behind that uniformity and sort of the structure is the code, the institution, the church. You can say here the mosque or the synagogue, which has been decided. So there is a purpose for the production of these books out there. So, and this is a picture of the religious leaders, the church authorities, those who decide what canonical books should be included or not included, what is apocryphal, etc. So there is that behind the scene, behind the scribe, behind those people making the books, there is a social institute where they also have to attend, because they're all schooled. So in Ethiopia we have the school system and the traditional sort of church, which is sort of modeled on the early Odessa school. So you have, you learn the literature, gears, language, writing, painting, etc. So the scribes are a product of this institute. So it's not a random person just writing. Then we get to the type of books, and this is here where if you start analyzing the layout of this text, you will see, for example, here, this is a typical Psalter where each Orthodox Christian or a priest has to have a Psalter of David, Psalms of David, including which also includes prayers of different prophets and sort of the prayers of Mary and passages from the Gospel. And in every case, the Psalter is always written in one column. I have no idea why. There's different interpretation. Where I asked one priest, and he said, because this is the oneness of God. So David sort of begins talking to, begins sort of addressing God directly. So this is one explanation which, everyone's open to his own interpretation. But all production of psalters are always in one column. When we get to the Bible, it's either 2 columns or 3 columns, and it's beautifully decorated with what we call harag, so beginning of the text. You have this decoration. So you see there is certain structure to the book. It's not just what you see. There's some decisions that have been made, and when you get to the illuminated manuscripts of such apocryphal work like here, Nagara Mariam, which is the history of Mary, it's also known as the Little Gospel, which was a 5th century, the earliest fragment is a 5th century Coptic fragment. This is an illuminated version, which is at the British Library, which is a huge manuscript, and you have the whole text. This is a royal manuscript. So here a work has been commissioned by royals, and there's a sort of purpose to the text. And another important example in the library, again, where the art sort of differs from what you've just seen, is this work which was produced by a very famous scribe called, I have to go a bit faster now, it was a very famous scribe who established an art school in the 16th century. We have 5 manuscripts of his. So he sort of integrates text, calligraphy, and painting. How am I doing for time?
You're doing fine.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay, so behind the church, behind the institution, the most important element is the community. Where you have to drive that sort of ideology. And so here is where the scribes would probably pay more attention to their work to satisfy this community, because there's a need for the book. Here is an example of a deacon and a priest reading probably a passage from probably a gospel. So the function sort of is defined by the community more or less than it is by the church. Then we get to the most important side, which is the client. How do we understand sort of the purpose of this text is to see what I explained, that the psalter is, it's a requirement for every priest to have a psalter. So here is a priest here reading a psalter, and he's also has done his own decoration where he's covered it with a silk. And this is one of the sort of traditional church school where they're having a discussion of opening of a church school. And here, this is where you'd have the canonical books, the important books being given to the church. But then on the other side, there is the book as an object. It has many purposes and functions, not just ceremonially, but sometimes it's medicinal. So certain texts or books are used, for example, if you suffer from, this is a text I recently read, if you suffer from nocturnal demons and nightmares, you would have a psalter next to your bed. And if a woman wants to conceive, she should read the Gospel of John, etc. There's all these traditions about book. But the other unwritten sort of hidden rules of production is this scroll, amulet scrolls, used for protection. This is a picture that was taken by my friend Sean in Tigray of a woman, who's a blind woman, which has a big scroll. You can see here, an amulet here. Judging from the scroll, she is suffering from a serious ailment. So it's covered. Usually scrolls are not read. So you wouldn't read or touch it with water. There are certain rules around it. So the production of scroll, unlike manuscripts, is a different rule, hidden rule, or rules that we're still not familiar with. So the structure of the amulet is this. It's called Kitab, taken from the Arabic word. And it's sometimes now scholars are preferring to use the word spiritual healing, because its function is to heal. But they also include important talismans and names of angels to sort of invoke the text, sometimes the physical text itself to be invoked. It's not just the prayer that works, but the actual element, the scroll itself, has that power to heal. So when it's being read, the power sort of manifests physically on the object, as opposed to a wizard saying certain magical words, and the words have power. But in this case, it's the text that has power, and that's where its protective element comes into it. So it's worn and never, displayed only for the sick person to look at, not for anybody else, but the sick person. So you would lay it before that person. And the word talisman is a Greek derivation, which just means powerful medicine. So the talisman sometimes is also a text that could be read. So all of this talisman, you see, they all have a function and purpose, and we will never actually figure it out because everybody has their own interpretation. This is sort of inspired by the Ring of David, or it will probably come to me later on. But yeah, this is inspired by a story that David built a labyrinth to hide his concubines. And in the middle, sometimes that image is represented as the demon being bound, imprisoned. So sometimes this text will begin with, I bind you in the name of, etc., etc. So yeah, again, other forms of writing is the talisman itself. The talisman can be read, and sometimes the talisman works as an agent of the written word. So it's the seal. Without the talisman, sometimes the text doesn't function. This is a saying that the clerics usually say. So the scribes, now working with this kind of with this talisman or divination, have been given the name Daptara. They're highly learned scholars. Some of them speak several languages. And the equivalent of a Daptara would probably be an alchemy, possibly, but someone who's also has a function in the church. Yes, not ordained, but they do have an important function in the church where they are poets, they are writers. And this important figure, Daptara Aster, which this was a book from Henry Salt, who was in Ethiopia, early 19th century. They made Daptara Aster, and I think he presented them also with some manuscripts. The Daptaras produced this work, so they are sometimes feared by the church, and at the same time respected for their knowledge, because they are the scientists. This is a recent picture that was taken by, again, I think Sean, I'm not sure who, of a scribe, which it still exists today, the tradition that still exists of scribes. And I really like this picture because Ethiopian scribes do not use table. They use their knee, and the purpose for this is the way the reed is made. It's how it functions, apparently. So scribes do not use table in Ethiopia. This is a very unique aspect. So one thing that I have sort of been interested in my research, and I've been looking at for quite a while, is this handbook of practitioners. This is a personal book of this Daptaras, where they have all of this information that makes no sense when you're reading it. It's passage here where sometimes I have to catalogue. yeah, when you become familiar, you know, it's just to undo a charm against childbirth, where babies die in the stomach. So in this sort of handbooks, one thing that I want to focus on my research is trying to understand the layers of this text. A fine example is this text here, where he has a random talisman drawn over here, and at the bottom he's made a code to say the purpose of this talisman is not for this text, but it's somewhere else. So they have this sort of hidden secrecy as well about the text. And here I try to show a certain example where in the sort of the Daptara code, there is what they call barter, where if you meet another scribe with, say, remedies of herbs, plant, they do exchange knowledge, they do exchange books. And this is one of the fine examples where Daptara would collect spells from different Daptaras. So the handbook itself tells quite a lot, you know, a lot of stories done, and it's always in a very mediocre hand. Well, not really, but yeah. So the other, again, beautiful example, which was in the Harry Potter exhibition, was this handbook from 1750 by a scribe, and this is a collection of talisman as well as prayers used for making scrolls. We know because the scribe specifically says this in this, that you know, this talisman is good for this illness or to undo this spirit. And the layout here is much more organized than other handbooks, because my suspicion is that this was produced for someone who was in the court, was somebody who was more important. So it was with the aim of possibly someone using it, and he leaves a sort of, usually after the incantation, it sort of ends with Lagabrik, which is your servant, and the name is written, and here is blank. So there's a purpose behind this production of book. So it's on Google Art Museum online, so you could have a look at it if you want to explore further. So the scribal code is very flexible in that they're not restricted to just producing religious or dogmatic book. There's certain freedom and element, and there is sort of power, but at the same time, the rigidity of it doesn't allow them to write secular text, because it's not something that we find this until much later. So it's sort of, to sum up, this is sort of the scene behind the production of this text, where we have this simplified sort of, you know, chart, but where it begins, where it starts, it's really difficult to figure out whether it was a scribe who first started writing, copying, but it's always in the circular, and there is an element of hierarchy that has to be observed. And the other sort of remarks I want to kind of make is that, so a lot of their work is unique and it is specialized. So if one scribe specializes in writing a psalter, that's pretty much what he would be an expert of. It requires a lot of knowledge, requires, and it's not just merely copying. There is this sort of belief that the copyist is this just copyist without any opinion or thoughts. This is not the case in Ethiopia, because there was no scriptorium like in Europe. It was, scribes were working individually, and sometimes they were working from memory, because the school that they study is memorization of texts. So, you know, it's driven by function, driven by aesthetic, of course ideology, and of course economical, where now they still produce these books, but they're not cheap to produce, because to produce one of those prayer books I've showed you, it's a flock. You have to kill at least 100 sheep. So it's not, sorry if there's any vegans here. But, and they smell as well. This is one thing that I didn't mention, which I can't mention, is that when I am looking at this manuscript, which my colleagues here will testify, is you have the smell, because the parchment retains smell there. So you smell the incense, the church. So certain manuscript I can smell and say, this was from a monastery because it has a good incense, and then I could say, oh, this belonged to a poor priest because it will have a strong smell of spice. This is kept in the house, so they have smell, and sometimes they make noise because they do, expand and construct. So the book is alive. So a really good book if you guys are interested in making the sort of the book and how it's made. Is this book that's written by John and Annie, who I know. They run the Anglo-Ethiopian Society. So it's they went to Ethiopia and visited this village of scribes who have been there for centuries. And so they visit the scribes, they talk to them. They still make parchment, though their main day-to-day living, they're all peasants, but educated sort of in a traditional way. So they still do make parchment, but it's expensive, and they still. So if you are interested, I've read, and then I've listed here certain bibliographies, but this is a good start. And thank you. Sorry.
Next up, we have Hooda Kaira. Hooda is an independent researcher with a background in public international law and is a member of Thicker Black Lines Artists Collective, which uses print, typography, and design to artistically and intellectually testify to a transnational and Black European diaspora. Thicker Black Lines is intent on building upon an outdated framing of Black British art as new needs, professions, and technologies emerge, and engaging with the materiality and methods of print and production to do so. Her practice focuses on the political positioning of Black people globally, and she has shared work at a number of forums, including the Centre for Editing Lives and Letters at UCL, Senate House, Print Room Rotterdam, Chisenhale Gallery, and DIY Cultures. Hooda is an associate of Numbi Arts and One of My Kind zine. Thank you, Hooda Kaira.
Thank you, Pooja. And thank you, Ove, as well. That was beautiful. I've got a lot of things I want to pick up on that afterwards, not least all the kind of political discourse about what is Ethiopia and whatnot, but claiming my Somaliness here. And actually, maybe that kind of is a nice segue to sort of link in what I'm trying to do, what we're sort of talking about. So, of course, I thank you, the American Bibliography Society, for inviting us here to have this conversation. I really was sort of a bit torn when I was thinking about this understanding of inclusivity, and in terms of thinking about sort of the narratives of excluded stories and how is it exactly these stories are excluded. My research on Black British publishing is really sort of an answer to a real life kind of real life political sort of situation and an ongoing situation of the position of Black peoples, which is to say how racialized communities are understood and treated in not just in the UK but in the world. And I just want to sort of and I'm sure everybody understands this, but I'm just going to sort of put out the position here now that when I'm talking about race, it's not sort of this kind of sociological marker, this kind of, there are lots of different types of people in the world, but rather it's a political project, an understanding of identifying difference and then treating people differently accordingly. And this is not... Well, we can maybe have this conversation afterwards, Ope, about this not being specific to the European context and sort of thinking about where we're from in East Africa. But I think it's very telling that we're in sort of the American Bibliography Society and the way in which the New World sort of helps us think about this in sort of its clearest form, that the Columbian encounter and this, the indigenous peoples of the places that we now know the Americas, African peoples that were understood to be useful only for slavery, and the kidnapping and in put to work of African peoples and the kind of social issues that we still deal with to this day, and the valorizing of European peoples as people of the most developed, going from sort of our big daddies of enlightenment like Kant and Hegel, and how that kind of sits in with the way that we think about the world today. And books are not outside of that. In fact, books were kind of the number one way in which these ideas were kind of thought about. So I'm just kind of outline sort of the 3 points that I want to try and get to. So understanding the introduction challenges and the circumstance that led to the creation of Black British publishing firms. Understanding the written world is always already in an ecosystem. So you can't just have a book by itself. You have to have people that can write books and people that can read books. And how do you make books? And that kind of like circulation. And so if we're going to think about inclusivity, like who can be included, we have to think about it in sort of the sort of this wider context. And the third part, which is like what these kind of books, these books from excluded communities. And I'm sort of, in my example, I'm giving the example of African diaspora that are in the UK. How does that change like what's already there? Like, how do we understand what books are in the light of hearing other people's stories of what books are? Is there a conversation between books? Do we have sort of like singular stories of like, I can have my little sort of story of what a book is and, you know, whatnot. And I was going to use a publication called Savakal because although thinking about it now, it's kind of it's very meta in that it was going to be a sort of a digital version of a book. And we are thinking about sort of like the materiality of books and sort of those beautiful images, but we'll see how that runs. So, yes. So this is a quote from a person called John LaRose, who founded the first Black publishers in the UK, New Beacon Books, which is still running now as a bookshop. You can see it in Finsbury Park. It's not far from the station, Stroud Green Road. But he was a poet that came to the UK, as many people from the Caribbean did, as in education. But with the sort of when the UK was still a part, the UK still had colonial power over the Caribbean and parts of Africa. He became a poet. Sort of he came to study as a barrister, and sort of left it all and became a poet, which I always think is very romantic. But also had like a job as a bricklayer, you know, to pay bills. But he makes this point that the old publishing firms grew up within the colonial preferential market. Not only they gave us the word, but told us how to use it. From his experience in Trinidad, having books that were published in London explaining the color of snow and sort of the different types of rain and the way in which he wasn't able to have exposure to books that were able to describe his own world. Never mind the books that were actually written by people from his community. In the UK, many Caribbean peoples living in the UK created a sort of an artistic network called the Caribbean Arts Movement, whereby people would gather, oftentimes in people's homes, to share stories, share their poetry, share their critical writings, and this would be then published internally in oftentimes really beautiful manuscripts, but very sort of because naturally these are sort of self-published. They're not sort of the sturdy books that we were hearing about, sort of these Ethiopian texts that last like thousands of years. So unfortunately many of these texts are not available to this day, although New Beacon Books has its own archive called the George Padmore Institute that keeps sort of many of the sort of ephemeral that was created from the Caribbean artist movement. John LaRose and his colleague, Camus Braithwaite, had sort of long conversations about how they would share their work. They were very much a part of the AntiColonial movement, not just in the Caribbean, but also all the places that Britain had colonized. There was kind of a movement of peoples in the UK, people from colonized nations in the UK organizing together, trying to think about how to a different way. And in correspondences, which if you see the actual ephemera of this, I think is so beautiful. It's like it's kind of old, sort of like I think it's not a fax. God, am I sounding really? I'm not that young, but like it's like it's typewritten. So like this is transcribed, but they are speaking in patois to each other, and they are speaking about the sort of the publishing firms and their difficulty of getting their stories published. And so I'm not gonna embarrass myself by reading this in exactly, but we understand this. And the point that I love the most is that is we who speak to we now. That's the new beacon must survive and grow. That's why Bogle, which is Bogle Overture, which is another black British publishers as well, must survive and grow. Why Sevakal, which was a publication that was founded in the UK but then sort of lived the rest of its life in Jamaica, must survive and grow. So the idea that if not only is it that that works have to be produced, but they have to be produced also by the communities that they serve, and that kind of hopefully will go into sort of the ecosystem of ideas and what books belong to. And this is just a picture of everyone. So Kamal Braithwaite is the gentleman with the glasses. We have John LaRose and Moustache in the middle, Andrew Solke and Sam Selvon. So these are the two sort of leading figures in the Caribbean artist movement. Nonetheless, during this time in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, there was an explosion of African and other African diasporic authors that were being published by British publishing firms. So there was a special imprint of Heinemann called the African Writers Series that that is responsible to this day to having some of the most important texts, I think, in what we would understand in African literature, works like Chinua Achebe's Nyong'o wa Nyong'o. And I always find that really interesting because someone like Nyong'o wa Nyong'o, a Kenyan writer who was very much a part of the anti-colonial movement in for the British against British rule in Kenya, but also very critical voice in the newly independent Kenya. He decided that after a certain point that all his works would be written in his indigenous language and not in English. But his critical works are still, like in terms of his essays and things, are still written in English in order to be accessible, but then they're also translated into many different languages, trying to improve a sort of a south-to-south language connection together. But nonetheless, he fully accepts and appreciates his work being published by Heinemann, to kind of talk about that tension between wanting to share work and understanding that the colonial networks are still a very powerful way in which to get works disseminated, but also being critical against those networks and the violence that enabled them to be as powerful as they are. And how do you undermine and use those at the same time? I think about the work of someone like Bessie Head, a South African author's work on a question of power is one that literally she's speaking against Penguin and everything that Penguin stands for, while also being published with Penguin. And many of us in the diaspora wouldn't know her work if not for these publishing mainstream publishing houses having their work. At New Beacon Books, there is, like I said, there's a beautiful repository of work and information, paraphernalia, and is an archive. Is a beautiful archive called the George Padmore Institute, and the John LaRose thinking about the longevity and understanding how do we commemorate and archive and make available the history of what's happening now, the history of the activism that was taking place in the sort of from 1966 onwards, when George Padmore Institute, New Beacon Books was first established, and I'll speak about kind of the specificities of the movements that were taking place at that time. Created this archive to sort of hold these works. John says publishing implies initiative and autonomy, the validation of ourselves. That's why I founded New Beacon, to think about the book as a reflection of that autonomy, as a kind of as a physical manifestation of somebody's ideas, thoughts, feelings to be shared around, but also that there is a and then understanding that those people that come from marginalized communities, the added impetus, the added sort of gravitas of these written text in being one of the few examples of autonomy in a system that tries to systematically deny autonomy and of peoples. These are some of the publications that were made through New Beacon. So if you know the work of C.L.R. James, his fiction, Minty Alley, there are as well sort of opportunities to sort of interrupt narratives and academic narratives of Caribbean and African peoples' intellectual histories. So we have a political biography of George Weeks, and sort of kind of an ethnographic study for peoples of those communities, as opposed to sort of a generic sort of academic ethnographic study of Carnival by Errol Hill. And sort of this kind of mixture of works. And all of this is, again, to respond to the needs of the community at the time. And so when this is also another independent publishers, Allyson and Busby, and there's a picture there of Buchi Emeche, and this again. So there was a maybe like 4 or 5 during the 1960s to the 80s of black publishers in the UK that were really sharing exciting work. I always loved the story of the spook that sat by the door, in that this was a story that was written by an African-American author that was unable to get published in the US, but was able to be published in the UK. And then, as you've ever seen the film afterwards, it's a really important film. So New Beacon Books wasn't just a place that created books. It wasn't just the publishers. It was a kind of a site where black communities in the UK organized and congregated together to not only just share ideas, but also to enact political action. So behind me is a collage of images relating to the New Cross Massacre. The New Cross Massacre is the death of, I think, 12 young people at a small house party in New Cross. This was after a series of black homes had been firebombed or had sort of racist epitaphs. Also, it faced violence. At New Cross, it was found that the fire services and the police services were very slow in attending to the fire, which led to the sort of needless death of young people. Here we had some of the largest demonstrations against basically a state that did not recognize and didn't want to support its racialized communities, the black community specifically. The New Beacon Books was a sort of a real lightning rod of organizing around this issue, and creating literature and publications that highlighted the kind of failings that were taking place, and the community's response to what the kind of countering the narrative that was being presented by the police and the fire services and the mainstream media about the fire. There was also a Black Parents movement that sort of centered around the bookshop. And I think this is what I'm talking about when I think about sort of an ecosystem of books and reading. Racialized communities coming to the UK from the 1950s, there was a systematic education system policy of putting children who into remedial classes, into what was known as education subnormal. So category. These are children that are coming from oftentimes English-speaking countries, but nonetheless, because they're black, they're considered to not be able to meet the educational requirements, educational needs, status that the British education system had sort of lofted itself. So adding to that, many children were being targeted by police in stop and search, at the school gates, even in times interrogated in school, and also facing racist treatment by teachers. And so New Beacon Books, as a publishing firm, published reports around this issue, and also was a space that the bookshop, the publishers, was a physical space where parents were able to meet together, organize and strategize ways around and outside of this policy. So here we have a march in Haringey relating to the treatment of black children in schools. And we have here, I love these, there's a lot of photographs around sort of supplementary schools and Saturday schools where parents sort of took upon themselves to make sure that their children were able to have at least basic literacy and have the sort of literacy and numeracy standards that they would need in life, because they found that the schools were not able to do that for them. Bernard Coard, who I'm not going to go into politics of Bernard Coard, but he wrote a sort of a best-selling book, the first best-selling book at for New Beacon, called "How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System." So this book was the New Beacon's bestseller precisely because it spoke to a need, a want that the readership in New Beacon were asking for. Oh, yeah. Not only was New Beacon responsible for creating books, it also supported, made links internationally. So this is a picture, an aerial view of the Black and Third World Book Fair that would take place in around Finsbury Park, that would have speakers from across the world, be a giant book fair where different publishers could come and share their work. You could hear about specifically about different political activism that was taking place. And so this was really a site specifically for the anti-apartheid movement, which was really heavily supported by New Beacon. And I think that may be the last slide. Savakal. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this publication, in that it was founded in the UK, but then migrated to Jamaica, and I think today is still, no, it's not still in publication, but many important thinkers from the Caribbean use this as a space to share their ideas, share their poetry, share their critical works. There's a specific essay that I wanted to think about the story of novel, plot, and plantation by a Jamaican theorist, Sylvia Wynter, that really, for me, illustrates the link between the historical moment where the written word, the book, becomes sort of mass-produced, mass printing, and the kind of ways in which it shapes, that the physical book shapes the way that we think, and the attempt of the writers of Savakal to break open, break apart, and think around this way of thinking that they identify as being coterminous with New World slavery, with the plantation system, the understanding of plot, not just as a linear story, but also sort of the physical space of plot, and ways in which people sort of put to work in that space. And I just sort of wanted to sort of leave that open for us here. If we're thinking about books as the material life of books, material culture of books, how they, we can think about sort of textually how they look, how they feel, but also how they make us think, and what the world around us, how they make us think. And I'll pick up this point with Abe a little bit later, in that what I think is really important about Black publishing firms, but also what I don't want to valorize is too much, is that they are responding to a way in which African Black voices are systematically sort of cut out of a narrative of what it is to be sort of the written word. I was recently at the Royal Anthropological Society, and sort of from 1850s onwards, there's the text relating to African peoples. We all kind of know about the science. I don't want to rehash the sort of scientific racism and sort of the kind of anthropology around what Black peoples, their stories are, but if that word makes any sense, black people, it was because of perhaps a truth was identified in that there are communities of people who do not have the written word as the primary means by which understanding is shared, what stories are shared, and that in the 21st century today, the written word is prime. You know, if we have we don't use the internet with just like emojis, although I do love emojis. The written word is a way and primary means by which we communicate. And the country that I'm from, Somalia, we didn't have a written language until sort of the early 70s, as a necessity to be a modern nation. And so there's also perhaps a violence in that having to use publishing and use the written word to counter narratives of yourself that perhaps are not ones that are indigenous to the way that you think and feel about things. So I wanted to sort of, have this kind of contentious story, but also sort of a beautiful, amazing, creative story of Black British publishing, to think about that history that is realized and also what cannot be realized in the form of the book. So I'm going to leave it there. We're going to have a conversation afterwards. Thank you very much.
So finally, we have Dr. Brooke Palmieri, a Philadelphia native now living in London. And here I should add, in full disclosure, that Brooke lives with me in our home with our dog. Panelist and co-organizer of this event, Brooke has worked on both sides of the Atlantic in libraries, bookshops, and as a writer, educator, and volunteer in archives and special collections, both institutional and community run. In addition to running the business Camp Books, which specializes in books, ephemera, and archival materials related to LGBTQ+ history. Since 2015, Brooke has edited Printing History, the journal of the American Printing History Association. Beginning in 2016, Brooke has served as a member of the faculty at London Rare Book School, teaching the queer book. Recent lectures they have given include A Queer View of Printing, delivered as the 109th George Parker Winship Lecture in Bibliography at the Houghton Library of Harvard University. Finally, as part of their work with Camp Books, Brooke is an avid printer and studio member of the London Centre for Book Arts and a member of the Feminist Print Network. Take it away, Dr. Brooke.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you. I mean, I wrote initially, we can only accomplish so much in one panel, but I think we have accomplished a lot in one panel, even without my contribution. But I hope tonight will at least inaugurate with work that has just been featured, some new dialogue between both individuals as well as communities and institutions, and also hopefully launch some new initiatives to collaborate between those groups. Because I think it's worth saying from the outset that a lot of the work of inclusivity is the work of recovering and acknowledging those people who have already been engaged in that struggle and who have already been doing that work. And I think Iyab and Hooda are already people who are doing that work, so it's important to have them here tonight. In my own work, I find that those efforts of engagement have happened for centuries. The marginalized, the minority, the subcultural have always had to take the means of production into their own hands, as well as to work to ensure the survival of their own stories. They've always had to stick up for themselves, and I think Hooda just did a great job of showing why that is. And they've also had to document the fact of their sticking up for themselves. And I think inclusive bibliography is about paying attention to that and celebrating it. Now, tonight, I only have time to focus on one example, but one from many possible examples that I've come across in my travels. And this one example comes from the collection of Barbara Giddings and Kay Tobin Lahusen. There they are, at the William Way LGBT Center in my native Philadelphia. But I'm focusing on this example because I believe it involves people whose lives and work have permitted me to speak to you tonight. Giddings and Lahusen's legacies make my own sense of vocation and my own words, and in some cases even my own choice of phrasing those words. They make that all possible. The world I live in was in part imagined and created by them, just as it was in part imagined and created by other activist struggles. And their 9-box collection, as it exists in the William Way Center, is also an example that I believe nourishes and shapes principles of inclusive bibliography as I understand and attempt to practice them. So I continue their work and the work of many others who have struggled against prejudice and the havoc that it wreaks on people's lives. To describe Barbara Giddings and Kay Tobin Lahusen briefly, Giddings became an activist for gay rights beginning in the 1950s. She founded a chapter of what was called the Daughters of Bilitis in New York in 1958. The Daughters of Bilitis was a lesbian organization that originated in San Francisco in 1955, and at a DOB meeting in Providence, Rhode Island, Barbara Giddings met Kay Lahusen in 1961, and they spent the next 46 years of their lives together. So Lahusen, who published under the name Kay Tobin, one of the books being called The Gay Crusaders, about the kind of early gay liberation movement, was a writer and photographer, and she's often the person behind the camera in many of the photos that I'll use today. So together, Giddings and Lahusen's criticism of, nevertheless, their meeting place, the Daughters of Bilitis, was that as a group, it was not political enough. And so they balanced their involvement with activism elsewhere. In the 1960s, for instance, they were involved in some of the earliest picketing and protesting in Philadelphia where they lived, an event that happened outside City Hall every 4th of July from 1965 to 1969 called the Annual Reminder. The annual reminder that the 4th of July was not a day to celebrate the freedom of all Americans, not African Americans, not immigrants, and not gay and lesbians, who nevertheless existed and deserve equal rights and protections. So here's a picture of Giddings taken by Lahusen marching in 1967. And it's just one example of their lifelong commitment to marching in the streets. The first image I started with shows that even into the 80s and 90s, they were still going strong. Now, alongside all of this activity, the most sustained focus of Barbara Giddings' work, supported throughout her life by her partner, was, in fact, bibliographic. She was involved in the Task Force on Gay Liberation, the first professional organization in the United States to address LGBTQ rights. It was founded in Detroit in 1970 as part of the Social Responsibilities Roundtable of the American Libraries Association, although it is worth saying that the forces in 1970 that conspired to make this possible were in turn informed by the Wolf-Enden Report in Britain in 1957, the picketing and rioting throughout the 60s, including the Stonewall riots. So there's an international dialogue amongst at least English-speaking people happening here, as well as involvement and learning from the civil rights movement that's happening and picking up at this time. A lot of borrowing. So here's a picture of their earliest press release. And note the aims, which in a sense embed librarianship and bibliographic work within a wider culture of politics, one which politicizes bibliography. So here are the aims. General, to work toward the repeal of laws. Oh, it might be too small. Well, I hope this. To work toward the repeal of laws which oppress the homosexual. Another general aim is to work towards changing social attitudes and social stigma attached to homosexuality. Another is to have freedom to be ourselves without fear. And finally, to support and encourage gay organizations and their efforts to accomplish the above goals, i.e. to work from within the profession in dialogue with people outside of the world of books, outside of libraries. But they also stipulated aims as librarians. One was to have freedom from job discrimination. The other was to revise classification schemes and subject heading lists in order to remove homosexuality from the realm of sexual aberrations. Since the late 19th century, it had been categorized as criminal. And then finally, to support members of other minority groups within the American Libraries Association in their efforts towards freedom and equality. So there was a sense of solidarity with other struggles built in there from the very beginning. And that was also reflected in the membership. Finally, they wrote, they wanted to provide bibliographic resources for librarians, individuals, and organizations. And among those resources was called A Gay Bibliography, which you will note describes itself as a carefully compiled nonfiction bibliography that emphasizes materials that support a positive view of homosexuals and homosexuality. So not necessarily the psychiatric studies that describe it as criminal, occasionally stories where people have to die in the end, but for the most part, stories that have happy endings. As Giddings wrote of this effort in a 1990 pamphlet that she published about the history of the task force called Gaze in Library Land, you see it there. I've actually copied this whole thing and I'll have a PDF available of it soon. I'm about to upload that. That's kind of on my to-do list. As she wrote, gay books, libraries, that rang bells for me. I went to early meetings in New York in the fall of 1970 and was welcomed. The group was ambitiously planning a sizable annotated bibliography. Meanwhile, a short list of the most positive materials available was wanted for distribution at the Midwinter Conference of the American Libraries Association, and I helped put together that first nonfiction bibliography, dated January 1971, with 37 entries. Books, pamphlets, and articles. That first list was easy. We were still 10 years away from the great explosion of gay materials that would mean reader's delight equals list maker's plight. Although what she's actually taking a very positive spin on is the fact that there just wasn't good, there weren't books available to people. And that too is a problem. So now these bibliographic efforts were part of other activities within the world of books. So at the ALA conference in Dallas in 1971, they awarded the first Gay Book Award to Isabel Miller's historical novel, A Place for Us. At the time, that novel was privately published and so hard to get, but in light of the publicity, it was picked up by McGraw-Hill and published as Patience and Sarah. But they also, at this conference, had a kissing booth, and here is Barbara Giddings kissing the prize winner, Isabel Miller, in it. This is bibliographic history being made. Seriously. So, kiss a homosexual. Here's a 1985 poster of events, jumping ahead over a decade. By the time after the AIDS crisis had already resulted in the death of 12,000 people and the infection of over 15,000 more. But this is also after the time that Giddings describes in her book as the great explosion in gay materials. And you can tell by the events that it includes, which are about the profusion of materials and their handling. So the first one is, you want to look at what? Indexing the lesbian and gay press. There's a book on blind lesbians and gays, The Lavender Pen on cassette and braille to describe the profusion of materials for the hearing and vision impaired. And then there's also work about visual culture. And you can't forget that there's a party in a spacious apartment in Chicago. Because the best thing about all these events is they also recognize that socializing is an important part of queer history. But moreover, these activities were nourished by activism once again outside the world of books, in the streets, such as the annual reminder, but also boycotting homophobic establishments, protesting police brutality toward queers, and by the 1980s, promoting education and resources related to AIDS awareness. Now, sifting through the photographs from this small collection of conferences and marches, scraps of paper with book reviews made by Giddings. Here's an example of a book called Consenting Adult. A mother lives through her son's coming out in the 60s, strong background of social change. Pro-gay conclusion, just a fair novel. There are magazine and newspaper clippings with book reviews and advertisements by other people in this collection, and there are many correspondences between Giddings, reviewers, and friends. And to go through this material slowly, you recognize that an archive of material starts to accrue that speaks to the bibliographic efforts of a single individual, as well as her place within a collaborative effort. And that also attests to the relationship between her efforts and other publishing endeavors. In the Giddings-Lahusen files, there is a list of books by the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop in New York, which was the first openly gay bookstore. There's correspondence with Jeffrey Escoffier, who was another Philadelphia activist who published a periodical called The Gay Alternative. There's a press release from two of Giddings' friends, Lige Clark and Jack Nichols. Clark was the publisher of a New York-based, the first weekly publication, a gay periodical called Gay, where, and here's a picture of some people reading it at a Rutgers conference in 1971. And in that column, Leo Louis Martello, an Outwitch and Gay Liberation Front activist, had his first column and also ran a book service out of his apartment in New York featuring pagan materials. All of which is to say, in very quick but overwhelming terms, condensed into a few seconds and a few people's lives, that if you look into the pile of materials that gives rise to the enumerative bibliography of the gay liberation movement, you start to find materials and material descriptions of how these things were made themselves and of the ecosystem that cultivated them into existence. I'm really glad you used the word ecosystem because we're going to make it happen. We're making this happen. Of the combinations of technologies involved in these materials, from letterpress to film to photography to IBM electric typewriters and also the first computerized desktop publishing, all of that is documented here. And I believe that the implications of sifting through this bulk of materials and understanding their reliance upon one another has countless infinite potential for both the field of study and also the people that we need to welcome into the field to study it with fresh eyes. The expertise needed to look at these materials is as varied as the materials themselves. And that is inclusive in terms of integration in its fullest sense. Which brings me to make 2 points about inclusive bibliography. I'll just leave this as I begin to conclude, because I think it's a very calming image. 2 points. The small one is that inclusive bibliography ought to integrate the 2 branches of the field as it's academically known. Bibliography as a works cited list, that's called enumerative bibliography, with the kind of descriptive bibliography that has made possible academic study of, say, book history, print culture, and media studies. We have to recognize that one tool of the survival of marginalized communities has always involved that they make their own materials and keep their own records, and that includes making their own lists and bibliographies. Then, looking into the creation of these lists, arises the stories of the people, the places, through piles of correspondence and collaboration, and also provides a way for us to enrich the practices of descriptive bibliography and what they have to tell us about textual production, cultural heritage, its creation, its preservation, and its exchange, by and large, outside of mainstream publishing and institutions. But there's a second point that I think also must be made about inclusive bibliography, and it's that our studies must be accountable to the politics that these collections cover. So it must be grassroots. It must be a field powered by communities first and foremost. And for that reason, it's a field that must be led by their example and must privilege their experiences and needs. And I hoped it went without writing, but I should say, this means giving people paid jobs for their expertise. Collections of materials kept by Barbara Giddings and Kay Lahusen survive at the New York Public Library, Cornell University, and the University of Amherst. But I wanted to focus on the 9 boxes in the William Way Center because they allowed me to view materials differently and therefore think differently about community-powered bibliographic work due to the nature of the space in which they were kept. They let me see a bigger picture that was very different from how many institutional libraries work. And I'm not saying to do away with institutional libraries. I'm saying that this is where the dialogue opens up. This is where there's room for communication. To set the scene, the William Way Center is first and foremost a community hub for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in the Philadelphia area. They run a range of services determined by the needs of the community that are recreational, educational, and cultural programming. When I was there was a mahjong club, there was a bridge club, there's a book club, there were film nights. You get the idea. But also, every time I walked into the reception hall, where there are tables, chairs, couches, and someone who's very friendly at the welcome desk, the music playing was always a total anthem. There was Madonna, there was Lady Gaga, Sister Sledge, Sylvester, Donna Summer, Beyonce. It was an incredible rite of passage each time to make a pilgrimage up to the quiet 3rd floor to go through like a kind of club-like environment. And that too prepared me in a very different way to encounter the materials that I did. The archive and the library itself at the William Way Community Center documents the center's history in exactly these terms. It documents the histories of those who have used it. It was founded in 1974, and in that sense, the archive and library have always been both secondary to the operations of the center itself, but still integral to its life, developing alongside the building itself, always present in the form of exhibitions, and always available to the people who move through it. To me, this embodies an aspect of inclusive bibliography that I was just describing because it puts people first, namely the communities whose work and lives lead to the creation of these objects, And first is where they have to be. The work of cataloging this material then, and typically of compiling any bibliographical information, ends up being done in-house and is shaped by that environment, and sometimes environments of incredible duress or just lack of resources. What is special and distinct about collections grown in this atmosphere is that they are beautifully idiosyncratic, but usually fit to purpose for those that live and work among them. So for instance, to walk into the archives at the William Way Center, you have to get in touch with the director, John Andrews, whose office simply is the room where the collection is. You sit at a table near him, and you come and go as you please, and you're surrounded by the archives collections, so you can see how everything relates to one another or doesn't. It's not alphabetical and it's not by subject heading. So you can build new relationships between everything at the pacing of your own choosing, based on your own desires, based on serendipity, conversation, and in my case while I was there, even overheard conversation. And I've found that this is true for the William Way Center, as it is true for many local LGBTQ archives. The Lesbian Her Story archives in New York, the GLBT archives in San Francisco, the Gerber Hart Library and archives in Chicago, and moving outside of the USA to Allied Causes in London, the Feminist Library in Southwark, the George Padmore Institute at New Beacon Books, the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton. So as I said at the beginning, Barbara Giddings and Kay Tobin Lahusen are only one example, but tracing their bibliographic work back through the books they consulted gives us both a roadmap backward in time and all the possibilities that come with that, which I'm willing to take back to the 3rd century, because you allow me, through a roadmap backward in time through different books that they read to recover centuries of censored history, as well as a pathway forward. Because following their deeply interconnected struggles across collections, with other collectives and individuals alike, provides a way forward, an example to follow, as well as many documented examples not to follow. So it gives us both a sense of what to keep and move on with, as well as what to leave behind, but still know about. So I believe now, as Barbara Giddings believed when she mined the bibliography of Donald Webster's Corey's 1951 book, The Homosexual in America, to find more about her own history. I believe that seen in this context, one of the tools that could be useful in imagining a better future is literally bibliography in this fullest sense. But in her footsteps, I equally believe that work continues to remain in making such a resource possible. Because if we are to document the survival of people in the face of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, ageism, all forms of discrimination, no one person can undertake it alone. And finally, I believe that if it were possible to build such an inclusive bibliography, I think we would be following in people like Giddings' footsteps by using bibliography not as an end in of itself, but as a tool, more importantly than for intellectual resources, as a tool for building solidarity between people. Thanks.
Thank you, Brooke. Right, so thank you so much to all of our incredible panelists. That was everything I could have hoped and dreamed of and more. And now we have time for a few questions. There will also be time after to discuss informally over refreshments. But does anyone have any questions?
Come on now, don't be shy.
Katie.
Yes, I have one. Do I just yell or is there
You can either approach the mic or I can try and repeat your question, which could be embarrassing for both of us. So.
It's quite a simple question, so it springs up what Brooke was saying at the end. It's a question for Isle. About where we keep these things. And you spoke about amazing Ethiopian manuscripts that are at the British Library now, and you spoke about how these manuscripts, some of the manuscripts are still being used in communities today. The manuscripts that are at the British Library, should they be there?
So the question is, the manuscripts at the British Library, should they be there?
Well, I get this question.
Sorry, I mean, you don't,
I get this question quite a lot, but I never had it like direct. It's usually, how do you feel, etc. But I mean, okay, so I have to sort of give you a picture of how many manuscripts are in Ethiopia. So it's estimated to be from 500,000 to close to 1 million. So it's covering medieval. And there's probably about 3,000 to 5,000 manuscripts in Europe. So they sort of enter in Europe from the 14th century onward. I'm trying to escape your answer, yeah? So I'm giving you all of this. But the way I see it at the moment is that I want to work with this material. That's my sort of immediate sort of need. I want to firstly work with this material and then give access, is what Brooke was saying, that the root of Ethiopian studies sort of lies in Western tradition. And what has always happened is that they've never have given access to everyone. It's always, it's very elitist. So it's always the specialist who is studying, let's say, Semitic language. And so the richness of Ethiopian sort of material is not known to a lot of people. For example, I gave example of the Book of Enoch earlier on, and these are texts that were lost in Europe before, before Christianity, some of these texts, and they exist in fragment throughout Europe, but they only exist in a full entirety text in Ethiopia, only in Ethiopia. This includes a book of Jubilee, which was written by the time of Moses. So I want sort of people to, I want to share this. This is my sort of, but whether they should be here or not, maybe I'll answer that later. But, did I escape that?
That's a nice one. I didn't want to ask, I don't know anything about these manuscripts, how many of them are there, so that's something that's useful context.
Any other questions?
I was going to ask about, you touched on it a little bit, and it's maybe sacrilegious because we're here in a bookshop, but the role of things like video for communities, like the Smiling community. If it can't be put into words, what exactly?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this the other day because Somali government had a Snapchat account, and people were like, oh my God, look at this. This is so the kind of belittling government. But I just thought that's just so practical. We're a community of people who, and especially because after the Civil War, so literacy is not the biggest thing, but this kind of visual medium that the internet has created, where you can actually have sort of address your communities very, in the way that we now, 5 years ago, we'd think that there'd be heads of state talking on Twitter the way they do, and as much as they do, and the kind of nonsense that they say. So technology has just changed. But I'm always very careful about giving primacy to the written word and giving primacy to the written book because of the history, its history, and the ways in which communities that don't use written language as their primary means of communication that has been used against them to qualify and quantify all manner of abuse. At the same time, I like books as well, and people do lots of things, and not everybody there are lots of Somali people that write as well. I don't want to say that nobody does. So it's having a plethora of materials that can do that, and including video in the idea of bibliography as well. Why does there has to be sort of a dichotomy between them? Brooke, I think as well, you had so many beautiful visual.
One of the interesting things about the gay bibliography is it starts including film by the end of the 70s, which is interesting. But I agree with you. I think something that is very special about the here and now is that we do have a lot of media to choose from, and allowing those different media to complement and be in conversation with one another is an important way of starting to address the wrongs of writing as a dominant form, as a colonizing form. If that is something that with you.
And I think thinking about the history of the book, you can't take it away from its religious context.
Mm-hmm.
I know that in where we're from, the Kitab, that's the word that we use for the Holy Quran. It's that would be the only written book that people would have. And I think to this day there is something sort of this kind of holy about books. We're in this place here. Look at, especially now it's dark. Look at the lights. There's something very romantic and sort of like heady about the book, and I think that's what still survives to this day. Like we've got in the world of PDFs and like websites.
Another thought I'm having is that the practice of bibliography, by and large, is meant to deal with loss. It's meant to deal with the fact that from books can only tell us so much, and we want to get as much information as we can out of them about how they were made and who made them, because we don't have film, we don't have other forms of media to interrogate and learn about them. And bibliography is about trying to make those objects speak all that they can. But if we live in a society where that is not the case, where there are many forms of media, then it seems to me that bibliography would be stronger if it were in communication across media. And there are people also integrating that approach as well. But one place where you do get it, as I said before, is community archives. You see it. Something amazing about the William Way Center is that they're very aware of the fact that the history they're dealing with is still living. And so they take great pains, not only to provide a bridge club for those people who are still alive, but also to take down their oral testimonies. So you can, because we know, there are survivors who were at the Stonewall uprisings, who are at the annual reminders. So there are amazing oral history projects being undertaken. And that too requires collaboration, because that's the type of skill sets that they're very different from analyzing a book. So that too calls for integration of more people with more abilities.
Two more questions.
We're going to have to edit that out of the video.
I think the numbers show that, right? I mean, it's very white, it's very male, it's very middle class still.
Yeah.
How do we get more community archives represented?
Give them money. Yeah, you got to make jobs for folks,
I think one of the in the British Library, we have the community sort of engagement officer, which was just recently introduced. And I did a show and tell, and it was for the local community. And probably it's one of the best show and tell I've ever done, because I was engaging with not scholars. I mean, you were all learned probably. No, I don't mean it in that, no, sorry. But I mean, there were people who were really not familiar even with the British Library, and they were asking whether they had to pay to get in, and really didn't understand the purpose of that public institute. And I remember, and I was there describing Ethiopian manuscripts, physically showing them, and they had a lot of honest and interesting questions. And I think that was the only time where I was satisfied. But unfortunately, this is not encouraged in most institutes, where it's not really something that senior curators would not encourage this. Say in other institutes, don't know about the British Library.
I guess I would just add that I tried to give as many examples as possible, but if you look in your local area, you will find local collections, and paying them to train you if you are at an institution, or if you have the means to do so, to tell you about their collections, I think is an important first step. Every city has them. Yeah. Well, and the event was pitched at, as I said, we've only just started I suppose a conversation that needs to happen elsewhere.
There's also only 40 chairs.
Yeah.
And this is speaking to a great multitude and movement.
Yeah. But this is where money comes in, because it is a barrier to have to even get transportation to central London in a lot of instances. So it's even that creates obstacles.
It's also important to engage as well. So,
Yeah.
I tweet quite a lot. I don't know if some of you
Yeah.
know, but it's the only way I can communicate with Ethiopians who are not familiar with the library, who can't access this manuscript. So sometimes it's very important to be an activist as well,
Yeah.
not just work for my own research, which doesn't really benefit anyone.
Layla, did you have a question?
Craig, what was sort of related about the idea that's been so powerful is about the collective of many hands, and all of your presentations from the manuscripts in Ethiopia, where you've got those wonderful bindings where so many people have added in to the community archives that you're talking about. And I think what's so beautiful about that is that it seems to challenge this idea of an individual genius sitting there creating this work.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you feel about that sense of power in the collective.
Yeah. I think bibliography at its best actually helps us think about all the different ideas. Like we think in the traditional way that we use the word bibliography, that all the different ideas, where that singular book, where all the ideas came from. So like being able to footnote, to go, oh yes, this was from this text and this was from here, trying to show that sort of deconstruct that kind of singular authorial author and that singular universal viewpoint that kind of typifies modernity and the kind of the violence of modernity that. So when we're talking about all these different types of oppression, be it sexual orientation, race, class, all these types of things ostensibly are because there is an idealized subject, and which all of that falls outside of that idealized subject is available to violence, and the book has been sort of the medium by which this idealized author, this subject, modern subject, is able to sort of be popularized and not problematized at all. And bibliography, though, at its best, actually kind of makes us, when you look in the footnotes, you're like, really? Did he get that from that? All right, then, because that's kind of rubbish. I don't know when like you can start having a conversation with a book kind of when you know. And I think this is what this work does, is actually just pick apart what books are. Don't just take them for granted as this kind of holy relic, like this is the mutable word of God, but rather like, where is this coming from? And even in its physicality.
I also focus on the collective because I don't take for granted how many people it takes to change a dominant narrative, I mean, and I mean it when I say, I am up here because tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, so many people over time have had to stand up and make it possible for me to live, a life that aspires to feeling good about myself. And so I don't take that for granted. And those are the stories I look to honor, I suppose, in my own collecting and bookselling practice and my printing practice. So yeah, it's also important to emphasize collectivity because that's what social movements need to change. To create positive change.
I think we're going to wrap up now on that positive
On that note,
flip the table. Please
take to the street.
Please do stick around for a drink, for refreshments, and thank you so much. Thank you for coming in. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, Fuchsia. Thank you, Megs.